Well, welcome everyone to the 2023 Loyola Commitment to Justice panel on employment justice. My name is Gia Greer-McGinnis, the Executive Director of CCSJ and the York Road Initiative, and I'm excited to welcome you today. Every year, Loyola's Commitment to Justice Committee creates an event that helps deepen our understanding and commitment to justice. We work with partners across campus to help integrate this panel into events, curricula, and conversations all year. The hope is that what you hear today will open a doorway to a new way of seeing justice. We also hope that we might all go forth inspired to learn more, to participate in ongoing discussions on campus and beyond, and to contribute actively, both at Loyola and all the places where we live and work. We want to thank the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Cheryl Moore-Thomas, and Equity and Inclusion Faculty Fellow, Mariana Carlucci. We are grateful to the Office of the Provost for their ongoing commitment to justice at Loyola. We also want to thank Messina for being a long-standing co-sponsor for the Loyola Commitment to Justice series. Special thanks also to our other co-sponsors for today's event, including Comparative Culture and Literary Studies, Global Studies, Modern Languages and Literatures, Theology, Campus Ministry, the Career Center, the Center for Community Service and Justice, and the Sullinger School of Business. The topic selected for this year's panel is employment justice. Catholic social teaching recognizes the dignity of work and the rights of workers as fundamental to the human experience and necessary for a sustainable future. These principles call us to confront unjust systems that deny workers fair wages, safe and healthy working conditions, equitable treatment, and the right to form and join labor unions. Today's panel features the voices of individuals and community partners challenging workplace discrimination and economic injustice. Together, we will consider Pope Francis's appeal to reject an economy of exclusion and inequality and explore worker-led strategies for advancing employment justice. Our panelists will share their lived experience and will discuss how we may contribute to positive change in Baltimore, in Maryland, and beyond. I would now like to invite Emily Kane, Assistant Director of Social Justice with Campus Ministry, who will introduce today's panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my honor to welcome and introduce our panelists in alphabetical order by last name. Daria Hernandez Antonio is a migrant worker leader who has been part of Centro de los Derechos de Migrantes Migrant Defense Committee for the past 15 years. She is from San Luis Potosí, Mexico, and has worked in the United States in both agriculture and seafood processing. She has traveled to Maryland to process crabs with an H-2B visa for many years. Through the Migrant Defense Committee, she has shared valuable information about workers' rights with her communities in both Mexico and the United States, and has advocated for increased access to justice and an end to gender discrimination for migrant worker women. Edward Fine is an AP and pre-AP world history teacher for Baltimore City Public Schools. He graduated from Loyola with a BA in history and sociology in 2023. He is currently working to complete his Master of Arts in Teaching from Loyola. In addition to his work as an educator, Edward maintains a regular radio show through WLOY. He is very interested in education, history, and philosophy. He actively uses his passion for learning, education, and philosophy to advocate for first-gen and disability communities. Smarlin Ovages is an interdisciplinary major, psychology and English, with a writing minor. They work as a tutor and research fellow at the Writing Center. They are active in the Loyola community through various leadership roles. They have an interest in storytelling, innovation, and advocacy. They actively use the art of storytelling to advocate for mental health, social issues, and representation. It is also my honor to introduce this afternoon's panel moderator. Elizabeth Kennedy is a professor of law and social responsibility in Loyola Sellinger School of Business. Before law school, she worked for several years organizing workers for labor unions in Texas, Arkansas, New York, and California. After earning her law degree from the University of California at Berkeley, she practiced with the New York firm Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, LLP, and served as labor counsel to the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Since joining Loyola 15 years ago, Professor Kennedy's research has focused on worker-led strategies for building power and advancing equity, and her teaching interests include workers' rights, data ethics, sustainability, and climate justice. I would now like to invite Professor Kennedy up to the podium.
Thank you for that introduction, Emily, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to moderate today's panel. Gracias a nuestros panelistas. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today and your willingness to share your experiences fighting for employment justice. And thanks to all of you today who have come to listen, to learn, to reflect, and then to act. As humans, we're connected in so many ways. And one of the ways that we are connected is that almost all of us will work for wages to support ourselves and our families. But our workplaces aren't just a place where we earn a paycheck. They can be a place where we build community, where we foster a feeling of belonging, and where we are able to showcase our individual talents and strengths and creativity. While the work that we do may look very different, across this table, within this room, and around the globe, some things are the same. The dignity of that work and workers' rights are fundamental to Catholic social teaching. Whether you labor in agricultural fields or accounting firms, on a university campus, or inside a home caring for someone there, you deserve and should be treated with dignity and with respect, paid fair wages, and work and labor in safe working conditions. And yet, the workplace is so often the site of exploitation, oppression, discrimination, injury, and harassment. So how can we respond? Well, Pope Francis has called for a new justice paradigm and a culture of care that he calls integral ecology. Integral ecology means sustainable working conditions, fair wages, and an end to racial and gender discrimination, child labor, slavery, and human trafficking. These are transnational struggles for justice, for which our community partner here today, CDM, is a globally recognized leader. Now today, labor rights are experiencing a little bit of a resurgence. I'm sure some of you just reading the paper or listening to the news the last few weeks. Workers in jobs as different from each other as Hollywood screenwriters and hospital workers, Starbucks baristas and Amazon warehouse workers, auto workers, and school teachers are striking for better wages, for fair working conditions, to address the threats of artificial intelligence. And while things like AI may be relatively new, the struggle for workers' rights most certainly is not. Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, a name that graces one of our dormitories here at Loyola, was a staunch advocate for workers' rights and for the dignity of labor throughout most of the last century. She believed that we all have a duty to work for creating a more just and equitable society. Indeed, that is central to Loyola's mission. And that is why we have brought this panel here together today, to help us seek answers to hard questions. Questions like, how can we make our workplaces more equitable, more sustainable, more just? How can we, as a university, form workplace leaders and employers, managers, and global citizens who live out that commitment to justice every day? Now, I have some prepared questions for our panelists, and after that, I will be inviting all of you to ask additional questions, to continue that conversation, to share your own insights and your own lived experiences in the workplace and around the world. So, Vamos. Daria. Has viajado de México a Maryland con una visa H-2B durante muchos años. ¿Qué te motivó a unirte al Comité de Defensa del Migrante? Daria, you've traveled from Mexico to Maryland on an H-2B visa for many years. What about that experience motivated you to join the Migrant Defense Committee?
En mi primer y segundo temporada conocí a una señora que me presentó con el Centro de Derechos de Migrante. Por cierto, se los quiero presentar. Ella está presente, es como mi madre. Se llama Berta González. Está aquí presente.
In my first or second season, I met a woman. She's actually right here today. Her name is Berta González, that introduced me to the Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, or the Center for Migrant Rights.
Y el Comité de Defensa. A mí me interesó mucho saber más sobre mis derechos.
She also introduced me to the Migrant Defense Committee, and I was very interested in learning more about my rights.
Casi en todos los trabajos hay problemas y mucha gente no quiere hablar porque tiene miedo. Siendo parte del comité, yo puedo orientar a las personas que lo necesitan.
In most workplaces, there are problems, and many people do not want to talk because they have fear. Being part of the committee, I can orient people that need it.
Y estoy muy orgullosa de mí misma por haberme unido y por todo el trabajo que hemos hecho juntos. En mi propio trabajo he visto cambios positivos en mi trabajo gracias a que ahora me siento respaldada para levantar la voz.
And I'm very proud of myself for having joined and for all the work we have done together. In my own work, I have seen positive changes, thanks to feeling that I am supported if I raise my voice.
Un ejemplo que se me viene a la mente es que cuando empezó lo del COVID, las mujeres compraban sus guantes. A mí se me hacía muy injusto que ganamos muy poco y encima teníamos que comprar el material que necesitamos para protegernos en el trabajo. Yo hablé con el que habla español, que habla inglés, y le dije que no era justo que tuviéramos que comprarlo. En el contrato viene que todo el material que usamos para el trabajo lo tiene que proveer el patrón. Ahora ya nos ofrecen el material que necesitamos.
One example that comes to mind is when COVID started. The women bought their own gloves, and it seemed unfair to me that we earned very little, and on top of that, we had to buy the material that was necessary for protecting ourselves on the job. I talked with a person that spoke English, and I told him that it was not fair that we had to buy them. The contract stated that all of the material that we have to use for our work must be provided by the employer. So now they offer us the materials we need.
Sí se puede lograr cambios. Eso le digo a las personas que conozco para que se interesen en el trabajo. Que entre más personas luchemos unidas en el comité es mejor. Juntos podemos animarnos a buscar solución a los problemas.
Change can happen. This is what I tell the people I know so that they can be interested in this work. I believe that as more people fight together in the committee, it is better. Together we can motivate each other to find a solution to the problems.
Thank you. So, and I was just out to dinner with my parents last night, and whether you are a lifelong Marylander or you are on Loyola's campus for the first time, I think when you think of Maryland and you think of crabs, whether it's our, logos on our license plates, right, or the crab cakes that we had for dinner last night, rarely, I think, do we conjure up and think about the very people that make those crab cakes and make our crab industry possible, right? It's such an iconic part of Maryland. And yet I know before myself getting involved with Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, I had not myself really thought about who is on the other side of that work. Who is doing this very labor-intensive work of picking that crab meat out of those crabs, and where are they coming from, right? We think of this as a Maryland crab, and the crab that we eat here in Maryland is only possible when women like Daria and Berta are coming and traveling at great distance away from their families to come and pick crab meat so that our families can eat them for dinner, right? And so thinking about the shared responsibility we have then here in Maryland to protect those workers who are making that possible, and then the challenges that they face. I want to turn now because, I feel like that's such a great example of the kind of bravery it takes to stand up that Daria is talking about, joining a committee, fighting for rights, thinking about the specific things like during COVID, then who's paying for masks and gloves and ensuring that not only is that crab meat or the crops being picked, but the very people who are doing it are also sustained. I'll pivot now to Smarlin. I know you have not worked as a crab processor that I know of, unless your bio was not sufficiently in depth. But I do know from learning a little bit about you that your earliest sort of education about employment justice came from your family's immigrant experience. So what about their experience? You described your mother as such a strong advocate for workers' rights. Can you tell us a little bit about her experience, how it might be similar or different from Daria's?
Yes, of course. To start us off, my mom is a very strong woman, strong-willed. Growing up, I was very nervous for my parents because they worked in conditions. For example, my dad worked in very frigid winters outside with not a lot of layers, and I would be like, "You need more layers."
What was he doing? What kind of job?
Outside, he was either doing construction or working on welding and stuff like that. And while he did have some protection, he wasn't fully protected, so I was always worried that he would end up in the hospital. That was a constant concern for me. And in terms of my mother, I was constantly worried that she would have to sacrifice her health in order to put food on the table and get some money. For example, in her current job, she actually works in Amazon as in one of their facilities. And she has been having chest pains, constant chest pains, and that is, I was concerned. I was like, is this a health issue? Is it due to aging? She's like, no, I think it's due to work. And I was like, you need to change your work. You need to talk to somebody about this. And I'm actively working with her to get an appointment and stuff like that. But she's often discouraged by her peers to actually talk to management because they're worried that she will get fired or that they will get reprimanded as a whole. But I'm like, your health is the most important thing. And even though she does not know the language, she knows enough to defend herself. For example, she got threatened with getting sent home early or not getting paid or even fired for saying I can't do a certain job because of my health. I can't lift something that heavy that you're asking me to do because I'm worried for my health, I'm worried for my heart. And they threatened to send her home with no pay or even fire her. And I was worried that she was actually going to continue doing that specific portion of the job. But even with the limited English that she knew, she was like, I'll talk to the HR then. Let's see what they say, and they can send me home. So I was like, oh, that's really strong-minded. And the manager kind of freaked out and was like, never mind, I'll find a different job for you. Mm-hmm. So it's just things like that. Being strong-willed, and even in the face of for example, almost getting fired, just sticking to that your health and your family are the most important thing, because having money is important, but to your family, the most important thing is that you're alive. So.
Yeah, and that's, I mentioned that one of the rights of labor, it almost shouldn't have to be said that right to life, right? Like right to not be killed on the job. And yet, death on the job for workers who are the most marginalized, who face the greatest barriers to protections, and some of the barriers we just heard about from both Smarlin and Daria, right? Language, right? Understanding your rights. Even if you know your rights, feeling empowered to pursue them without the fear. I heard both the fear from Daria and Smarlin about losing your job. If you are on an H-2B visa, it's connected to the one employer that sponsored you. So if you have traveled at great distance and great expense away from your family in Mexico to come work for an employer here, and they are not treating you correctly, they are violating the law, they are not adhering to these Catholic social teaching principles of dignity of work, they're harassing you, sexually assaulting you, not paying you. They are doing any of those things and you protest, you don't have another employer to go work for. Your options are to go home and return to Mexico, potentially with that, in debt, because you have paid money to come here. So great consequences for speaking up, and yet people do. And it's as a result of speaking up that we get more rights. And Amazon actually has free, unlimited ibuprofen in like vending machines in their warehouses because they know that workers are going to experience systemic and chronic pain. And so you have to say to yourself, when you are in HR at Amazon and you are looking at a problem of workers in pain, is the right, just, ethical, sustainable, integral ecology response to just provide free ibuprofen for all? Or is it to maybe think about why workers are in pain in the first place and treat that root cause? But it requires workers to stand up, workers like Daria to join a committee, or even your mom as a single person and a single lone voice to stand up. Eddie, I want to turn to you. So, and both Eddie and Smarlin Smarlin is a current student. Eddie, you're both a graduate and a current student because you're in a master's program, but you are now out there in the workplace too, very different workplace. But you do have a unique vantage point as a Baltimore City school teacher. So I'm interested if you could describe the challenges. I know you mentioned you sort of have many different hats, thinking through the lens of first gen and through someone with a disability. What are those particular barriers, unlike or similar to or different from language and immigration status?
Yeah, so I want to begin my response with a little background. I have been an IEP or 504 student for almost literally my entire life. I first got a 504, and for those that aren't aware what I'm referring to, it's a Section 504 plan as mandated by Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act, not Americans with Disabilities, the American Rehabilitation Act of 68. So I first received my Section 504 plan when I was in elementary school. That quickly became an IEP, an individualized education program mandated under the Individuals with Educations Act of 97, I think. It was just recently reauthorized in 2020. I got an IEP middle school, and I had an IEP until I graduated high school. I'm now back on a 504, which is what colleges and universities are required to provide students with documented disabilities. And what all of these different documents are, I mean, there are whole classes at Loyola dedicated to understanding the difference between a 504 and IEP. But what all of these different documents are, they're just legally mandated plans for accommodations with individuals with disabilities. They lay out strategies that teachers and educators and even employers have to follow based off of that individual's disability. I'm also a first-gen student, right? I'm a first-gen master's student, and I was a first-gen bachelor student. Neither of my parents, my mom has an associate's degree, and that's it. My dad doesn't have a college degree at all. So I know, like, I wear the hats of both someone with a disability and someone as first-gen, and I see these problems in my classroom, these challenges in my classroom. I don't like to say problems as well. these are two separate communities with very similar challenges. Not to oversimplify, but I think they easily fall into three categories. The first is mindset, cultural mindset, social mindset, the mindset of friends, families, educators. The second is resources, because resources aren't distributed equally. And you can mandate by law that these people be treated equally, but without providing the funding to support those resources, it's kind of an empty promise. And the third one, the third category I would classify as unconscious bias. Not everyone is aware of their own biases. Not everyone is aware of the challenges of these two different communities. And sometimes you slip up. Like sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you aren't aware that something is ableist when it really is. Sometimes you aren't aware that you're making a first-gen student's life harder when it doesn't need to be. On the point of mindset, there is a social expectation to succeed. It doesn't matter whether you're a first-gen student or you're a student with a disability. There is this pressure to succeed at all costs. And this image of success is usually based off of someone who doesn't have a disability, who isn't a first-gen student. And to achieve that level, to achieve that image, and to hold that individual, it's a lot of pressure, and it does a lot of damage. It does damage to the self-conscious. It does damage to the amount of work and the potential of the student. On the resources front, I was very fortunate. When I got into Loyola, I was given a lot of money. And here at Loyola, there are so many resources, so many people dedicated to helping me. I can literally count like 6 people I was in their offices regularly beginning my freshman year in 2018. Just in this room. And so I was fortunate, like the resources were there in place to help me overcome the limitations of my disability. The resources were there to help me overcome the fact that neither of my parents have any frame of reference for what it's like to be a college student. Neither of my parents have any frame of reference and so what it's like to be a master's student. Neither of my parents have any frame of reference on what it's like to be a teacher and to be working in a field associated with a college degree. And neither of my parents have the resources to get me to that point, to allow me to be successful. So I was fortunate. That's not the case for so many people. Resources aren't always equal. And if we're looking at public education, I work in Baltimore City schools. I can tell you some schools are definitely funded a lot better than others. Some schools are in a lot better shape than others. And some schools can provide better resources for both students with disabilities and first-gen students than others. I work at a school that is well-funded, and I work at a school that does have the resources to push every single student. It's like 80% of students go to college. That's not the case across the board. It should be the case, but it's not the case.
I want to build on something you just talked about a few minutes ago about kind of on this topic of resources, but then also go back to Daria on this, because you mentioned that you can have the law, and the law may mandate certain standards, right? So we have, and those of you who have studied the law and studied the legal environment of business or are in the graduate programs, you are well aware that there are laws in place to prevent discrimination, to prevent harassment, to provide, in the context of schools, accommodations for students. We have these laws, and yet we know they're not followed. And so this question does come for me about what type of resources do we need, not just as an individual, which is a great point, especially in the education context, but in the workplace, what kind of resources do we need as a society to ensure that the standards we set for ourselves are adhered to. So, Daria, una pregunta sobre discriminación de género, gender discrimination, right? It's a critical issue in the workplace, especially for migrant worker women. Can you share some stories or experiences that highlight gender disparities? What steps can be taken to combat sex discrimination? And I'd love to hear from that and then kind of think through disability discrimination and sex discrimination. And again, both are prohibited by law, but what does it really take to ensure equity?
Por ejemplo, nunca he visto que una mujer sea supervisora. En todas las factorías que he ido, son hombres los que están a cargo.
For example, I have never seen a woman be a supervisor. In all of the factories that I have been to, men are the ones in charge.
Wow.
También hay diferencia entre los trabajos que le ofrecen a los hombres y los que nos ofrecen a nosotras. Para pesar la carne, por ejemplo, lo hacen los hombres. Y no creo que sea justo, porque no hay nada que hagan ellos que nosotras no podríamos hacer.
There is also a difference between work positions offered to men and those that are offered to women. For example, the men are the ones that weigh the meat, and I don't believe that this is fair because there's nothing that they do that we can't do.
Y ellos ganan más. A los hombres les pagan por hora y a nosotros por destajo. Esto quiere decir que nos pagan por libra, el cangrejo que limpiamos. Al final siento que ellos ganan más, pero es menos el trabajo.
And the men also earn more. Men are paid by the hour and we are paid by piece. This means that we get paid for how much crab we clean. In the end, I feel like the men earn more, but it's less work that they do.
Creo que para cambiar esta discriminación tiene que haber más supervisión de parte del gobierno. Se necesita que alguien venga y revise que se esté cumpliendo la ley, no solamente en mi factoría, a todas las factorías, porque en todos pasa lo mismo.
So to change this discrimination, I believe that there should be more supervision on behalf of the government. It is necessary for someone to come in and check that the law is being met, not only in my factory, but in all factories, because the same thing happens in all of them.
Y que las personas conozcan las leyes y sus derechos para que se puedan levantar la voz.
And she also wished for people to learn about the laws and their rights so that they can also raise their voices.
That's great. And yeah, I think that the idea of government, right, and trying to understand what we even mean when we talk about government. And in part, we often think of government as this standalone entity that will either come in and solve things, or you may believe that there's too much of it to begin with, right? So depending on your political perspective, what you think of government is often something out there, for better or for worse. And when I'm hearing the stories of Daria, and actually I'd like to hear too from Smarlin, I know storytelling I heard was sort of a big part of what you view as a tool for social advocacy, sort of reframing what we think of as government as all of us in this room and what we do to push our government, to be the government that will uphold the standards, to resource. When we talk about resource, I mean, we're talking about money, right? And so we often talk about not wanting to have higher taxes, et cetera, right? But like, what would it take to fund an organization, a government organization that would adequately go in and inspect these factories that Daria is working in, right? To ensure that people have the resources they need, to ensure that women aren't being discriminated against. What would it take to resource schools that Eddie is in to ensure that students with a disability have a pathway? Just as I think you can all imagine, if you work for 15 years in factories where you've never once encountered a female boss, the idea that you yourself could become a boss in that industry probably seems pretty slim, right? I would venture that also for folks who are living and working with a disability, needing to ensure that there's a vision and a pathway for your success is also critically important. So how to ensure that, right? Part of that is government. Part of it is, you know, again, seeing ourselves in this room as those who are pushing and advocating, being like Smarlin's parents and standing up at the right moment. So with that, Smarlin, what's your reaction to Doria's stories here? Like how, in your experience on campus and trying to push for social justice, like what would you, talk to us a little bit about the importance of storytelling. I think hearing these stories here today is really important, but what do we do with that?
Sorry, it took me a second to think. All right. For the first part, for like my reaction to her story, given the topic, I was expecting there to be a disparity between the pay, but I was not expecting it to be by hour and then versus by amount. So I was not expecting for it to be that big. And as for the importance of storytelling, you could throw statistics at people all day, but they won't humanize those statistics. For example, with COVID, we got numbers on the daily, and it was really depressing to see that number. And it got extra depressing when you thought of the human beings behind those numbers, but that was necessary because they were no longer just, oh, another person died. It was this human being, this father, this mother, this sister, this brother had died, and we need to find a way to fix this, or like a vaccine, as we did. So it just humanizes the statistics and like connects with people on an emotional level, which is part of what you need for change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eddie, do you have thoughts on that too? I mean, as a Loyola student here at this university that has at its core of its mission to do this work and to share these stories and to learn from one another's lived experiences, reflect on it, act on it, what could we be doing here at Loyola to really get more students talking about these issues that for some are very personal and their parents' experience, their own experience, it's their life, and for other students, they learn about it for the first time coming here on campus?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm actually going to combine my answer with this question with another question you presented earlier, later. And I'm going to start by piggybacking off of Samara. The power of storytelling is amazing. Like, you'll be astonished what a good story can do. Everybody has a story, everybody knows a story. And, you know, I arrived at Loyola in 2018. I'm still here. I'm still here long after everyone that I knew has graduated and moved on. And there's power to knowing that story. Story is also the way we frame history and the way we frame our understanding of others. Here at Loyola, one of the things that we can do, and actually I dare say it's one of the things that we should do, is to understand the power of a story. One of the most common TED Talks I've ever gotten is called The Power of a Single Story. It's a very common TED Talk from, I don't remember her name, but she's a South African speaker. And she tells of the consequences of framing her experience in the box of just what we expect someone from South Africa to be. The same holds true for both first-gen students and students with disability. We need to move away from this understanding of disability as something that's always visible, because it's not always visible, and it's always deeply impactful. Disability isn't always being in that wheelchair. Sometimes disability is being unable to write. Sometimes disability is being unable to process information in a timely manner. And so at Loyola, we can begin to understand we can begin to understand where our students with disability and where our first-gen students are coming from by simply digging into history. And by history, I mean story. Understanding how we are framing these people that we meet, these people that we interact with every day. History is nothing more than a story we tell ourselves based off of facts. The personality of people that we interact with is nothing more than a story we weave together based off of what we perceive the other to be. Understanding the role of the story is how Loyola as a community can begin. Disability isn't always visible, and you can't always pick out a first-gen student. Understanding that everybody has struggles and that these struggles are defined by different systemic experiences and different lived experiences. That's what's important. And by embedding that in curriculum and embedding that in everyday interactions, Loyola, one student at a time, can make the world that much more tolerant for anybody with a disability and anybody going through this process as a first-gen student.
Great. Yeah, I think we do tell ourselves a story a lot. We tell ourselves a story of who we are as Loyola, what kind of students we are. Sometimes it's dangerous when we start to think we're telling a single story or a single narrative, and it speaks for everyone, right? And I spoke last year with a student who's graduating from Loyola, whose parents had a very similar lived experience to Daria, were migrant farm workers, and this was her life, juggling her helping out with her parents in their farm and being here on campus the rest of the week. And what a different experience, and yet she is part of the Loyola story. But the Loyola story and who we are is not a single story, but we need to sort of include all of those. I would love to hear a story, Daria, about examples where it's different from what we have heard and what we expect in farm work. So COVID was a great example, Smarlin, that you raised about stories and statistics. And one of the most awful statistics I remember during COVID was actually the impact of COVID in agricultural work and the number of workers who were dying in the fields. And at rates based on the kind of housing, people are living cramped, people are living close together, it is impossible to socially distance. People were not provided with masks. People were required to continue working because they were essential workers, but they were not given any of the essential protections to ensure that they themselves weren't bearing a very disproportionate burden of this global pandemic at that moment when many of the rest of us were able to work from home and to shelter. So we saw many stories of the worst decisions that employers can make that put their workers in harm's way, that led to their death, illness, impacted their families. I would love to hear, and I hope that they exist, I would love to hear from Daria, ¿hay historias de éxito o ejemplos positivos de empleadores que priorizan el trato justo y los salarios justos para los trabajadores migrantes? Are there any success stories or positive examples of employers prioritizing fair treatment and just wages for migrant workers?
Desafortunadamente, no conozco historias de éxito, pero sí puedo decirles cómo me gustaría que fuera mi patrón. Me gustaría que hablara español para que nos entendiéramos mejor, que le ofreciera trabajo a hombres y mujeres, que las mujeres tuviéramos la oportunidad de ser supervisoras, que el salario no dependa de cuánta carne limpiemos.
Unfortunately, I do not know any success stories, but I can tell you how I would like for my employer to be. I would like for my employer to speak Spanish so that we could understand ourselves better, for him to offer work for men and women, and for women to have the opportunity to be supervisors. I would also like for our wage to not depend on how much meat we clean off.
Todavía hay mucho por luchar. Hay muchas cosas que queremos conseguir y juntos, como comité y con otras personas como ustedes que hoy me escuchan, sé que podemos lograrlo.
There's still a lot to fight for. There are a lot of things that we want to achieve together, and with the committee and other people like you all here listening to me today, and I know that we can achieve it.
So important, right? So much work to do. Thinking back to what I talked about earlier, Maryland being this crab state, this one we take great pride in and love to eat, knowing that we don't have success stories. There isn't a gold star we can hand out. There's so much work to do. And thinking about what our role is. I would love to now hear from Smarlin and Eddie. Coming from Loyola, we're trying to train you all to go out there to be that model employer, to have a revisit of this panel in 2, 5, 10, 15 years and be able to say, this is the model. This is how folks listened to the comité and answered the call for justice. So what can we do here at Loyola? What would resonate with students? What will get us from this point A to point justice?
Sorry, I'm getting my answer straight.
It's not an easy question.
If
it were.
It's not. And again, I find myself returning back to the earlier concept of storytelling. As I mentioned, like I see this in my classroom. So many students struggle with meeting those high expectations that we place on them. And those high expectations, while let's be clear, you should always have high expectations for everyone, right? They shouldn't come at the cost of seeing the student as the individual. And one of the things that Loyola has done well for me, I can't speak for anyone else, but one of the things that Loyola has done really well for me is helping to identify people as individuals and understanding that student A isn't always going to have the same needs as student B, and that you need that flexibility to accommodate both student B and student A. And I think that's really important. I think if we continue to frame, if we continue to develop this narrative that we are looking at individuals, we're not looking at a person in a wheelchair, we're not looking at a first-gen student who doesn't know English. No, we're looking at individuals and their talents, and we're building off of those talents, and we're using their strengths to prop them up. I think that's what's going to get us to that gold standard. And I think I'm on that track myself because I have spent so much time thinking about this. Teaching, in particular, is a very reflective practice. In order to teach, you have to understand, okay, this lesson went well, this lesson didn't go well, this student really got it, this student didn't really get the lesson. And you need to be able to reflect on that, and you need to be able to learn from those experiences. And I think that holds true for so many other higher positions.
So seeing the individual, I think.
Yeah.
So seeing the strengths, getting back to what we talked about before, the dignity of each individual worker.
Yeah.
I think modeling it within this environment, an educational environment, what that looks like, what care for the whole person looks like, really understanding people's individual needs, but then extrapolating on a larger collective level that there is also this strength in numbers that Daria is talking about, and that it's really by coming together as individuals, but as a group to sort of put this kind of, to create this solidarity, right? But I think definitely seeing people as individuals, if you can't see the humanity in the folks that you're managing or leading within an organization, within a workplace, I don't know how employment justice would be the environment that you're leading at that point. Like, you really do need to see people as individuals and their individual needs. And I think disability is an interesting way of looking at that, and I think those who have worked and lived with a disability understand that implicitly, and then those and that community of people around them, whether it be siblings, parents, teachers, coworkers, learn from that as well and understand that we are all individuals and need different things. But Smarlin, what about this for you? What is resonating?
For me, what I have seen from good employers, not only through my limited experience through like actual being a student worker, but also my internships, and just having conversations with family and friends, is one, transparency between employee and employer. So if they don't know what's going on, then they can't help you, but also in the sense that they have to want to know what's going on. So again, just seeing you as a number, or like, oh, I'm just getting profit from this. Like seeing the humanity in them, as we've been stating, and actually wanting to help them is part of it. Because while we're like, oh, we just want to make more money or like more of the product, in that framework of storytelling, making more money and making more of that product can only be done when someone wants to go into work, likes their job, feels safe. So get them to understand that by implementing these things, it would actually benefit them as well. So breaking that kind of lens that they have in that sense. But it's also kind of like, besides the transparency, it's just kind of like being realistic of what a human being could do. There's like, as we've been stating, expectations, but sometimes the quota is too much. Like a human can't do that. So just being aware of like what the human body is capable of, and not seeing that as a barrier, but instead being like, this is what we can do for today, or like, this is what we could do for right now, and that's okay, instead of just like, we need to like reap the benefits from these people all the time.
So you actually sound just like Pope Francis. I don't know if that's conjuring. Dressed a little differently, but
I didn't even notice.
in his Laudato Si 2015 encyclical, this is exactly what he was urging us to move away from, was this economy of extraction, of exploitation, of exclusion, and to move towards this different sustainable. We talk about sustainability a lot, and we talk about sustainability a lot in Salinger and at Loyola, and for good reasons. We're often talking about the environment and the natural environment, and preserving and sustaining natural resources. I think, Smarlon, you capture that exactly, about the need to sustain the human resources, the human body and psyche and soul, right, and spirit. And you can't do that. You cannot be a sustainable organization, whether it be in agriculture or crab processing, or whether it be Amazon, or whether it be Loyola, if you are not thinking about the individual human workers who are coming together, who, as I said at the beginning, we're here, everyone, what we have in common, we do need to get paid, and we need to get paid fairly, and probably always more, but what we also do when we come together and we work is to build this culture of solidarity, right? And you can see that in the work of Daria and Berta and the other folks organizing with CDM, the importance transnationally, solidarity, that is, doesn't stop, not only does it not stop at borders, but in fact, we need it to continue across borders in order for there to be justice, right? And you see it in the way that laws themselves, it's great if they're written, it's great if you have a standard, but enforcing it requires resources, and it requires folks to feel, to lend support and advocate for those resources that are necessary. We have just a couple minutes. I just want to ask each of you as a final question about what gives you hope and inspires you to continue your advocacy despite ongoing challenges and injustices. How do you keep up this work when there is no gold standard yet, but it is something that you are striving towards?
Hace un par de semanas tuve la oportunidad de ir a la oficina de Departamento de Trabajo en Washington para hablar sobre mi experiencia como migrante y como integrante del comité. Es algo que siempre había querido hacer, pero nunca pensé que pasaría.
A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to the offices of the Department of Labor in Washington to speak about my experience as a migrant and as a member of the committee. It is something that I have always wanted to do, but never thought would happen.
Estar ahí con toda esa prestándome atención, me hizo acordar del poder que tienen mis palabras, y me hizo pensar en lo mucho que he logrado personalmente y como parte del comité.
Being there with everyone paying attention reminded me the power of my words, and it made me think about how much I have accomplished personally and also as a part of the committee.
Ver los avances y los logros me inspira a seguir luchando porque veo que sí se puede y voy a seguir como comité junto con el CDM hasta haber logrado todo lo que necesitamos.
Seeing the advances and the accomplishments inspires me to keep fighting because I see that it can be done. And I will continue as a member of the committee along with CDM until we have accomplished everything we need to.
Sí se puede. Smarla?
Part of what helps me continue doing this work and continue doing this work beyond Loyola is that I refuse to be complacent in what we have now. My morality would not allow me to just sit by and watch the world essentially burn. And additionally, I just want to be part of the solution. It's always been a part of my plan in life. No matter what career I go into, I want to be part of some kind of solution. Well, saying humanity as a whole is a big kind of goal there, but maybe part of humanity, benefiting humanity in some kind of way. So yeah, and also my family, just hearing from my family and my friends and their experiences and knowing I have the resources and the education to make their life better, to improve it, so that they don't have to choose between food and work or work and health, and actually enjoy life instead of laboring their life away.
Your parents must be very, very proud.
Yes.
So what gives me hope and keeps me doing this work is that there's already been so much progress. You know, going through the process of becoming a new teacher and being a new hire, I can see it in my coworkers. So many of us are starting to recognize that you need to treat everyone as an individual, that there is no such thing as a single story. And that keeps me going. My goal, much like Marlon, I can't stay complacent. If you are complacent, you're not the solution, you're the problem. And you have to be actively engaged. You have to let others know, this is what I feel, this is what I see as the problem. But then you also need to actively ensure that you are working towards that goal. And that's what keeps me going. I feel that's what gives me hope, that we can eventually overcome these challenges and we can eventually achieve that gold standard just by continuing to work that way and elevating stories like we've heard today on the panel and like we hear every day from everyone that we interact with. Elevating those stories that aren't often heard and treating everybody as that individual. As we continue to do that, we're going to save humanity.
Thank you. All right, we have time for some Q&A. Are you walking around? Someone have the microphone? Do you have any questions, comments, responses?
Thank you. I was just wondering, when did the Migrant Defense Committee start? When did it begin?
¿Sí sabe cuándo empezó el comité de defensa?
Yo empecé desde hace 14 años.
I started 14 years ago.
Also, Rachel, would you like to say anything about city?
17 years.
Okay, so this is Rachel Micah Jones. She is the executive director of CDM. She founded CDM, how many, 17? 18 years ago. Actually, do you want to say a few words? Not to put you on the spot, just about the committee, how it formed, and yeah, how long it's been in operation.
Yeah, so I started CDM 18 years ago after having been a farm worker lawyer in Florida and realizing that most of my clients would go back to Mexico and really needed a base of support throughout their experience. And shortly after starting CDM, we were really focused on ensuring that the policies and that the work we were doing was responding to the priorities of migrant workers. And we supported the founding of the Comité de Defensa del Migrante, the Migrant Defense Committee, which officially launched over 17 years ago. And as Daria said, I think she's been a member of the Comité for 14 or so years. The Comité works throughout Mexico and the United States, and I know you've talked about it a little bit, but has been really important in winning protections for migrant workers, both crab pickers, farm workers, but also workers in other temporary jobs. So.
And you guys have had some big, when you're thinking about legislation and regulation, some real victories as a result of the work of Daria and others on the Comité. Do you want to speak just a little bit about that, or does Daria want to talk about the
Sure.
regulation?
I mean, I'll just say right now, you know, years ago there were no regulations whatsoever to the H-2B program, no protections. And it really was through the organizing with the Comité and a complicated strategy that we were able to win some basic protections. But right now we're in a process, a rulemaking process, where there are proposed new rules, and we need to comment publicly on those rules to be able to defend them so that we can actually solidify those new protections. And so that's something that we will be working on with members of the Migrant Defense Committee between now and November 14th, which is the deadline to submit the first round of comments. So happy to share a little bit more about that later, but I realize I'm getting maybe too detailed. But if folks are interested.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, you know, you need folks to make laws, again, when we think about what government is, right, that there's this public rule comment period, right? We actively solicit comments from folks in industry, from workers, from advocates, from students. I encourage everybody to really, if there are things that you're excited about, here in Maryland, in fact, in the Maryland State Legislature, when there are bills, you can absolutely go down to Annapolis, sign yourself in, and you can comment on them. I mean, do your homework first. Don't just show up and blather on. But there are things that you can absolutely, it takes your name, you are in the record, right? And it's so important. And it's, again, the storytelling. Some of those, it's the stories that I would venture to say, I'm not Rachel and I'm not her organization, but I know that when you're a lawmaker and you're hearing stories of people's experience in the fields, that's going to go a much longer way in getting them to understand what's at stake and what is needed for protections. And then the second part of it is, yeah, the resources, right? So now you have these laws. Now how do we ensure that employers and growers and factory owners are actually adhering to them? How do we ensure that workers like Daria and her colleagues can stand up without fear, right? How do we ensure that Smarlin's mother in the Amazon warehouse, right, is able to do the same? They're also organizing for unions in Amazon and have met with a lot of resistance, right? So how do we ensure that those rights that are in place to ensure that workers are able to speak up, have a voice, and form a union are protected? It requires a collective effort. Other questions?
I have one. Great. As I was sitting here listening to the stories that you so generously shared, thank you, I was thinking about whether the committee that planned this event has a place that students can go to see what they might be able to do after being inspired by this panel discussion and moderation. For example, I know at Loyola we have Kolvenbach Research Awards, and that students can engage in research in the community, and students have the power to collect stories and elevate them. And that's something I think young people seem to be pretty good at, putting stories out there on social media. And so I was just curious whether the committee that planned this event has some place that students can go to look for their next step in promoting justice.
Does someone on the committee want to speak? I think she's talking about places to go for more things. CCSJ.
Hi, yes, so they can come to our office, the Center for Community Service and Justice. So the program that you just described is one of the programs in our office. We're pretty much a one-stop for a lot of different pathways to engagement. We have an assistant director that works on advocacy issues, but also, there are many different ways to get involved. So happy to talk with anyone afterwards. Our office is in the Humanities Center, so across from the practice field, there's a sign that points to our steps. So feel free to come in at any time.
Also, feel free, if anyone here is at all interested in doing research on workers' rights, that's what I research. So this is what I do when I'm wearing my academic hat. And I would love to partner with you or to give you some thoughts and bounce ideas off of for where you might go, whether it's a Kolvenbach, whether it's something else, whether it's something for a class or a thesis. Please hit me up. I would love it. Love it.
I just want to add to that really quickly. I think that this is a great question, and I appreciate you raising it so that we can start to think about the action steps afterwards. Because I think with hearing these stories and being receivers of these stories, we then have a responsibility to take some action steps with them. I will also say that I would encourage and kind of challenge each one of us to think about, in the different spaces of campus that we occupy, how can we channel what we're learning and what we're hearing from this panel into those areas? Because there certainly are wonderful opportunities through CCSJ, but I'm also thinking about academically, right, through Selinger. How are we, as you said, forming these leaders to go out and create these more ethical workplaces? And I think there's ways to access that no matter where you are in your own passion and your own place at the university and beyond. So I just want to highlight that, and I think being at an institution like Loyola, where this is a part of our Catholic values, this is something we can lean into really strongly and say our Catholic social teaching is very explicit about the rights of workers and that being a priority. So I just want to name that as well, that no matter where you are, you can incorporate this into what you're already doing.
Absolutely. Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, with that, I did want to end thinking about, I referenced Dorothy Day before, and I was rereading a book and I pulled this out. She said, the greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution that has to start with each one of us. And so, I want to thank all of the panelists for the stories you've shared, both your own experience, the experience of your families, the experiences of you as individuals, but also your experiences in a collective. I think we've heard a lot about bravery and resilience and persistence, all of which is required to advance and ensure employment justice. I opened the discussion by noting that, most, if not all of us, are or will be workers in some capacity. Some, but not all of you, will also be employers. And in that journey, I urge you to reflect upon and return to frequently the stories that you've heard here today about the dignity of labor, about workers' rights, about what that really means in a workplace, whether it's really learning the language of the employees that are making your business possible and your products and your services possible, listening to what the issues are, responding in ways that are not, again, the Amazon, pill dispensary, but let's think about how we use the amazing technology we have in AI and automation to make things more sustainable, more equitable, more just for those workers, rather than to, as Marlon talked about, sort of squeezing every last drop of labor from them. Think about how we harness those amazing tools, how we use the amazing resources Eddie just talked about that you have access to here and during your time at Loyola and beyond, to use those resources, to use that great power that comes with such great responsibility to ensure employment justice for all. So with that, thank you to our panelists. Muchas gracias. Adelante, si se puede. Thank you so much.